Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. What next and who next for Andy Ruiz Jr and Joseph Parker? The pair both just fought this past weekend, Ruiz Jr getting a decision over Chris Arreola and Joseph Parker likewise also getting a decision. And I guess there was some maybe unexpected controversy and sort of excitement with the Ruiz and Parker fights respectively. Some people thought that Derek Chisora beat Joseph Parker on points, did enough to win, and obviously Chris Arreola knocked down Andy Ruiz Jr, which not a lot of people really saw coming, but going the distance in both fights. So what next? And I guess an obvious question is, could they fight each other? Because they do have history, obviously, having fought in a title fight the back end of 2016, Joseph Parker getting a narrow decision win in New Zealand to take the WBO title. And a lot of people have talked about that fight, a potential rematch in recent years, and is now as good a time as any. Well, possibly, and until now I would have said I didn't think it was likely because of promotional considerations, but actually Joseph Parker's 3-fight matchroom deal is up. So potentially he could be there to make a fight if they really wanted to make that, if there was the sort of will from both sides. In the New Zealand media, it's being reported that David Higgins, Joseph Parker's former promoter but current advisor/manager, he plays a key role in Parker's career. He is going to be negotiating potentially a new deal with Eddie Hearn, but also they might go shopping around the place to see what is out there for Parker. And if that was the case, if they left Matchroom, or certainly joining the PBC, 1-fight deal, perhaps even longer, they could get some fights within that PBC stable, including Andy Ruiz Jr. I wouldn't mind seeing the rematch, and after the last performance of both, I think there was some vulnerability about both. And given their history, the closeness of the first fight, I think that could make quite a good fight. But I guess in terms of Andy Ruiz Jr., immediately after the fight, he actually sort of said we can run it back in terms of having a rematch with Chris Arreola. That fight is there. It doesn't necessarily interest me having to see it a second time. I didn't necessarily need to see it the first time, actually, although it did provide some unexpected drama with the knockdown and Ruiz being hurt a number of times in the second and third rounds. I guess if that fight is to be remade, what's going to dictate that is the pay-per-view numbers, because if the number is big enough and they go, well, actually, this did okay, we can run this back, well, it could get made again. And given how Ruiz looked in that first fight, and clearly there was ring rust after almost 18 months out of the ring, it was his first fight with Eddie Reynoso, he wasn't sort of, an ideal finished, perfect looking sort of fighter in there. But I think in a rematch with more time working with Reynoso, and I think leveling out, just, staying at the weight that he was at, because I think he looked a little bit depleted in there. I think perhaps that played a part. Maybe the punch resistance was down a bit because obviously the fluctuating in weight with Ruiz through his career. He has been up and down, and he came down from over 300 pounds at the start of when he started training more seriously about a year ago, and almost 30 pounds down from his last fight. So I think 255, I know some people will say maybe he should go back up. I think that's a good weight. He has fought well at that weight before. The title fight with Parker was 255. So I think if he manages to maintain that, he's sort of bedding in some of the stuff from Eddie Reynoso, I think you will see a better performance next fight out. And if that's against Chris Arreola, I think he would put in a better performance, and it would be more dominant than he was in this fight. Although very good tactics from Arreola, the sort of box and move early, just wasn't able to keep it up with those 40-year-old legs. And it doesn't seem like they intended to keep that up in that second half of the fight, judging by some of the talk in the corner from trainer Joe Goosen. But Arreola, I think there would be some interest, but it depends on the pay-per-view numbers. Otherwise, why would you do it all over again? It would be a payday for Arreola, but does Ruiz get too much out of it? Maybe a more convincing victory, but that's about it, really, isn't it? One name I think that would be an ideal opponent and who probably couldn't replicate some of what Andy Ruiz Jr. saw against Chris Arreola with the movement is Charles Martin. He's very highly ranked in the WBA right now, and Andy Ruiz Jr. similarly highly ranked in the WBA, and we have to remember that was a WBA eliminator that he just fought in against Arreola. So you could end up having that as a potential final eliminator. Andy Ruiz Jr. and Charles Martin both in the top 6. It would make some sense. And as I say, Charles Martin, different sort of style matchup. He's a big puncher, southpaw, but he is not very fleet of foot. He is sort of slow as molasses and a little bit plodding, but he can punch. But I do think that that would be quite a fun and entertaining fight and a better style matchup for Andy Ruiz Jr. I can't see Charles Martin all of a sudden becoming some sort of mover like Chris Arreola was able to do for a number of rounds. I think Martin is a live option, but it's going to depend on some other factors as well, because you have another name there, Luis Ortiz. Ortiz has been wanting this Ruiz fight. He was there this past weekend watching that fight. Andy Ruiz Jr. said he would only consider facing Luis Ortiz after he had a tune-up fight. Well, that tune-up is been and gone. I'd love that fight. Although I think from a style perspective, it's a little bit tricky. I mean, Luis Ortiz can box, can move, and, very heavy hands. That straight left hand, very good. And I could actually see him giving Andy Ruiz Jr. quite a few problems. He's able to probably do what Chris Arreola did, but just better and for longer. And Andy Ruiz Jr. is a front foot counterpuncher. He works off what you give him. We saw Arreola was starving him early on. Imagine what Luis Ortiz could do. He would be in charge of the pace and be dictating the action in that one. So that's a much tougher fight for Andy Ruiz Jr. Although, I want to see that fight, that's for sure. And I guess the other name that is worth talking about is Deontay Wilder. A lot of people have been expecting eventually this is going to happen because at the moment they're the two biggest names in the PBC stable, both former champions, and if they fight it at some point, but potentially later in 2021, maybe early 2022, let's be realistic. They probably each have at least one fight before fighting each other. But as a next option, I like that fight, and given the vulnerability Ruiz showed, getting dropped and hurt a number of times, I think some people are warming up to the idea that Wilder has a much better shot in that fight than maybe some people otherwise thought before the Ruiz-Arreola fight. In terms of Joseph Parker, if Ruiz is not the option on the table, if he doesn't go to PBC, what does he do? Where does he go? And it's an interesting question because obviously they sort of almost, you want to say, promised Derek Chisora a rematch in the immediate aftermath of the post-fight interview, saying, yep, we can do this, we can do this. Parker said it, Andy Lee said it, Chisora said, I'll take that rematch. But then we had in the New Zealand media, David Higgins quoted as saying that he would like to see Joseph Parker aiming higher than Chisora. Ultimately, though, they always go where the most money is. So if Chisora as a pay-per-view next makes the most money for them, probably will take it. But if there's something else out there, that's the question. And they don't have a deal worked in yet with Matchroom to re-up with them. I guess the negotiations and a potential pay-per-view with Chisora, maybe that will all factor into it. We'll have to see there. But it was interesting in the New Zealand media. I'll play a very brief clip. This was from one of the news broadcasts. Seemed to be a little bit of divergent views from David Higgins and Joseph Parker, and maybe this is the influence of Andy Lee. Joseph Parker saying to the reporter that he thinks he's a few fights away from a title fight rather than having it next, and that when he does have a title fight, he wants to basically be the sort of finished article as good as he can be, as opposed to having not done something that ultimately helps, in his sort of downfall. Here's that clip.
It's not as close as I thought it was. It's still a distance away. I want to work with Andy on things I need to work on. I don't want to be fighting for a world title and then lose because I didn't work on things that I need to improve and get better on.
So I actually thought that showed quite a bit of maturity on Parker's part to realize that, although he's almost knocking at the door, he's got, decent rankings. He's number 3, 2, 3 in the WBO, etc. That there is some stuff he needs to bed in a bit more to have that better success rather than having the title shot, getting well paid but falling short. And I thought that showed a lot of maturity actually. But of other fighters that are out there, Well, that's a more trickier question for Joseph Parker right now, because he is definitely in that sort of who needs him type camp. A lot of other guys are sort of tied up, or you have, at the top end of the division, Fury, Joshua are sort of tied up. Usyk and Joyce might be fighting. Hunter and Hrgovic. We've seen that fight with Dillian Whyte before, and White's not really entertaining a rematch right now. So you kind of go, who's ready and available, but also a good style matchup for Joseph Parker? Because I think Ajit Caballero as an opponent, it's probably not a great style matchup for him. Caballero would box and move and probably, pickpocket some of those later rounds. It'd be quite an interesting fight that. There's a guy like Otto Wallin. I mean, he's not a promotional free agent, but working with Dimitri Salita. I mean, he's not necessarily tied to any one sort of broadcasting outfit. So that's an option. There's some internal matchroom options potentially. Martin Bakole, Hughie Fury rematch. Does anything really sort of stand out and grab you though? I mean, it does sort of seem that Chisora rematch is even though, do we need to see the fight again? And there was the controversy, but it wasn't necessarily a fantastic fight. It had its moments, but it wasn't a classic by any stretch. But that could be the sort of most viable option out there, given it would likely be on pay-per-view again in the UK. What do you see next for Andy Ruiz Jr. and also Joseph Parker? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.